Okay, we are recording. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for Doug Tallamy. We're so thrilled to have him speaking for us. I'm really looking forward to this. First off, I'm Molly Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of Sugarloaf, the North Shore Stewardship Association. And this program is sponsored by Sugarloaf and the Ikes, the Duluth Ikes program, McCabe chapter of the Duluth, Isaac Walton League. I always say that wrong. And also Wild Ones, the Arrowhead chapter Wild Ones. And we're each going to do a quick little hello, just quickly from Molly. I hope you get up to Sugarloaf Cove. We're located on the North Shore, Lake Superior, mile 73.3, and we'll be having a lot of programs going on this summer, including bird bandings on Thursday, and you can take part in that and a lot of other programs. And just quickly, a quick word out there, we are looking for some site hosts this summer, people to help greet people, a paying position or two on the shore. If you're interested, visit our website, sugarloafnorthshore.org. And let's see, Kathy Wood from the Wild Ones Arrowhead chapter. Go ahead.
Hi, yes, all right.
That's almost empty. Let me get the.
Ja, kannst du gleich das Kabelhorn?
You might enjoy this.
Oh, somebody, hold on one
This is
second.
Kathy Woods speaking.
Who's Kathy Woods?
Okay, somebody need to turn off your microphones, everyone, please. We're getting conversations. So
Okay,
I'm gonna mute all and then bring Kathy back on.
okay.
Oh, that's
Shh, quiet.
Okay. Kathy, you should be able to unmute yourself. Oop.
Okay, I'll do this quickly. Hi, welcome, everyone, and especially Wild Ones members. I wanted to just make two quick announcements before we listen to Doug tonight. First of all, Wednesday, April 28th, we're going to do our chapter native plant seed exchange at Hartley Nature Center in the parking lot at 6:30. And bring your labeled seeds from 2020 in blank envelopes so we can exchange seeds. But also at 7 o'clock, Judy Gibbs is going to lead a hike in Hartley after the plant exchange, and everyone's welcome. Bring your masks. And then the last thing is the last Saturday in May 29, in the Rose Garden parking lot here in Duluth, the Duluth Flower Garden Society is having their plant sale, and that is our chapter's fundraiser, our big fundraiser. And so members, please dig up and pot and label your plants and bring them to the parking lot at the Rose Garden at 7:30 in the morning, and we pack up by 9:30. Everyone's welcome to buy plants from all of the different garden clubs in the area. Masks are recommended. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. And then we have Rich Staffen from Duluth Ikes, Isaac Walton League, I should say.
Well, hello, everyone. I really want to thank Molly from Sugarloaf and Kathy from the Arrowhead Wild Ones for allowing us to join them and sponsor this great event. We're really excited about this event. And thanks to all of you that joined us today. I think we have something over 200 people. Molly said that have registered, so this is just a great turnout. I just have two quick announcements that I wanted to make. The League of Women Voters in Duluth asked me to announce a program that they actually have tomorrow night at 7 p.m. And they're going to have Ellen Anderson is going to share the science and policy that's created Minnesota's Climate Change Challenge. And Ellen is the Climate Program Director for the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And so she's going to kind of talk about the progress, actually the lack of progress that's been made toward Minnesota meeting its climate goals. And you'll also be able to kind of find out what you can do, how you can be part of the solution. So that's tomorrow at 7 to 8. And I'll I'll paste the link, the Zoom link for this meeting in the chat box after I get done here. And it's open to everybody. And then our chapter will have our next program at 6:30 on May 19th. And we're going to have Diane Desatel from the city of Duluth and Lori Seeley from SISMA in Duluth. And they're going to talk about the strategies that they're using to protect Duluth's natural plant communities from invasive plant species. So it'll kind of tie into some of what we're going to hear tonight, I think. And they'll also talk about what we can do as individuals to help with that. So that'll be at 6:30 on May 19th, and we'll be sending more information out to folks later on for that program. So I guess the only thing I'll conclude with saying is, you know, we all have the opportunity to be wildlife managers on the little patch of God's green earth that we're responsible for. And hopefully we can be good caretakers of that so we can pass that on to future generations. So I'm really excited to learn what we can tonight from Doug on how we can do a better job of being wildlife managers on our patch of the world. So let's turn it over to Doug.
Well, I'm going to do one more thing, Rich, here. I just
Okay.
want to, couple little Zoom etiquette things. Please, everybody, keep yourself muted. A lot of people on here. I've muted you all now. Put your questions down in the chat because it'll be too hard with this many people to take a lot of questions. So we'll look at your questions in the chat. And at the end, I'm sure we'll have a little bit of time, I hope, Doug. And you can turn your videos off. That way it won't be distracting to other people. So anyway, just a quick intro on Doug. A lot of you know this, but Doug Tallamy, he's a T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He has authored 104 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home, was published by Timber Press in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Darkey, was published in 2014. Then Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller, was released in February 2020. And his latest book, The Nature of Oaks, was released by Timber Press in March of 2021. He has many awards, including the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation and the Tom Dodd Jr. Art Award of Excellence, the 2018 AHSBY Morrison Communication Award, and the 2019 Cynthia Westcott Scientific Writing Award. And I love his books, and I hope you all get a chance to read his books. And now you can take it away, Doug. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Molly. 40 years, boy, no wonder Zoom makes me look bald. Wow. Okay, I want to talk about my idea of what Nature's Best Hope is tonight. But before I do that, I want to return to what happened on, at least on the East Coast in 2019. So not this fall, but a year ago fall. We had what we call an oak mast in the red oak group. All the members of the red oak got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it, and I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, forced its head through there, and then it forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally plopped down. This is a very dangerous time for this larva because it's good to eat. Everything's after it. So it gets to safety by wriggling and squirming below the surface of the ground. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a little chamber. And within that chamber converts itself to a pupa and then stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down at the end of that extension right there. Then they chew a hole with those mouth parts down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Well, you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year? Well, if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns because red oak acorns take 18 months to complete their development. But once they're gone, of course, that leaves a hole in the acorn, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny ants that their entire colony lives in the holes created by acorn weevils once they leave an acorn. And if they discover a new acorn, they're excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody, time to move. They grab the kids, they grab the eggs, and in 30 minutes, they have moved into the new acorn. Then they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes, and they'll live in this new one for the next 2 years until it falls apart. Well, I always practice my talks before my wife, and at this point she says, what's your point? What are you trying to tell us? I'm trying to tell you that that is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, mostly between animals and plants, that comprise most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of acorns. They will take an acorn from the tree and fly up to a mile from the tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the ground. And the idea is they're going to go and find it during the wintertime for food, but they only remember where they put 1 in 4 acorns. So they actually end up, each jay ends up planting thousands of trees every year. And that's why oaks move around faster than any other deciduous tree. Very specialized relationship. I found out this fall what is actually pollinating my witch hazel. I've always wondered about this. Witch hazel blooms, of course, very late in the fall after the leaves are down, frost is out. And the book says, well, it's gnats and flies, and I never see any gnats and flies on there. But if you go out at night and look at your witch hazel, there's a group of moths called the winter moths, several species that fly late, just when the witch hazel is blooming. This is the bicolored sallow. I actually caught a bicolored sallow this year on Christmas Eve, so they do fly late. And I don't know whether witch hazel is blooming late to take advantage of the winter moths, or whether winter moths are flying late to take advantage of witch hazel. But at this point, they depend on each other. You won't have pileated woodpeckers breeding anywhere near you if you don't have a lot of carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on. And you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Facilia, because that is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over 1/3 of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plant genera. So in your neck of the woods, there are at least 13 species that can only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead, on and on. We could talk about specialized relationships all night. The problem is that today these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that today we can't leave it as it was because we haven't. It's only about 5% of the lower 48 states. It's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. That's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are now running amok in our natural areas. In fact, we have carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. You might wonder why we've done all that. I wonder sometimes, but I think, we just thought the earth was so big that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing very frightening headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of the North American bird population gone. As a matter of fact, now the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably within the next 20 years. And I love the way they report this as if it's just another headline. I mean, they might as well say, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and go on to the next headline as if it's an option. It's not an option to lose oxygen. It's not an option to lose 1 million species either. We have to make sure these things don't happen. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment and thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus, the most famous entomologist of all times, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects. And he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats so drastically that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, even many of our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that right now rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have would be bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Good news is it doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We're totally dependent on healthy natural ecosystems that produce what we call ecosystem services that keep us alive. Here are just a few of the things that plants deliver. We talk about ecosystem services for humans, but it's for everything that's out there. Like that oxygen. You realize one large oak tree can produce enough oxygen in 70 days to keep me alive for a year. That's what plants are doing for us. They also clean water. You know, it rains, that water is headed to the salty sea where we can't use it. Well, plants slow down that journey and they clean it on the way so we can use it. They capture carbon from the atmosphere, pull it out of the atmosphere, lock it up in their tissues, and even more important, then pump the carbon through their roots into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Plants build topsoil, they hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, lots of very important things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds and lots of other important things. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is not an option. It never was a good option, but today it's a terrible option because we got 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. So, you know, wasting huge parts of the earth and status symbols like lawn is just not a good idea. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with the earth that supports us. And Aldo Leopold was certainly one of the most eloquent, wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said was the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been able to do that, but our huge Western societies, our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually go to a place on the earth and extract more than the earth can produce, completely ruining the area. Then we go to another place, do the same thing. Clearly not a sustainable relationship with the planet. So Aldo had a dream that we were actually capable of developing a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm it, lumber, graze, mine, do all of those things. But he dreamt that we could learn to do those things gently enough that we didn't destroy local ecosystems. And that's what he called the land ethic and wrote about it in Sand County Almanac. What he didn't write about, that I know of anyway, is developing a land ethic where we actually live. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue tonight, though, is that living with nature not only is an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. You know, in the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where there are a lot of people, because that's most every place. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Thrive, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where are we going to start? Let's go back to private property. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. About 75% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail because we'll be working on areas that are too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species that run the ecosystems. We need healthy ecosystems everywhere, not just in parks and preserves. But there are a number of places where we could do conservation, where right now we're just not doing it. I guess we haven't considered that possibility. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? We got 21 million acres in those types of landscapes. Railroad rights of ways, another 3 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are huge areas. Roadsides, 17 more million acres. And then we have all the places where we live, both in rural areas and suburbia, our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those places. If you add up just those areas, and you can think of others, that's 599 million acres where we could be doing a lot better job with conservation than we're doing right now. How big is 599 million acres? It's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, plus Montana, plus California, even throw Texas in there. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation just about anywhere. I want to talk about conservation. I'm really talking about reconstructing the natural world where we have dismantled it. And it probably is not going to look exactly like it did before we dismantled it, but it still can be functional. We just have to reunite the players in specialized interactions, and then you've got a functional ecosystem. But not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the building blocks, and then other species can join in. There's two groups that we can't do without. Talked about those flowering plants, capturing the energy from the sun, turning it into food that everything else depends on. But we're not going to have those flowering plants unless we have the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. So we need these two, but we also need to get the energy from those plants to the animals that need it, or we don't have the animals, then we don't have functional ecosystems. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that's something typically as insects. And it turns out it's not just any insects. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So a landscape that doesn't have a lot of caterpillars leaves most of the energy locked up in plant tissues, and then you don't have a functional food web. That's a dead landscape. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. Now you have the black-capped chickadee up there. It's practically the same bird doing exactly the same thing. During the winter, 50% of their diet is seeds. So we see them at our feeders all the time, and we tend to think, well, that's all they need. No, that's half of what they need in the wintertime. They eat insects in the other part of the winter, believe it or not. And during the summer, when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they rear their young exclusively on insects. And it turns out most of those insects are caterpillars, and they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my recent students did, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers all over the country and said, please take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're carrying food back to the nest. And send those pictures to me. Then Ashley was going to identify the prey items that are in the beaks of these birds, and then reconstruct the nestling diet of as many birds as she could in the country. And she got thousands of pictures. She was able to reconstruct the nestling diet of 20 of the common bird families in North America. The green bars, and that's what you're looking at here. The green bars are the percentage of each one of those nestling diets that was caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars. Most of our common birds would not be able to reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. Let's talk about what it is. Actually, there's several things special about caterpillars. And the first one is that they're soft. They're soft prey items. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. And because the wrapper is made of exoskeleton, it's cuticle, that's chitin, it's undigestible. The birds don't want a lot of that. And because this guy is soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, very low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So a lot of a beetle is undigestible, and most beetles have sharp edges. And it turns out the caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. Only plants make carotenoids. And we have to get them from plants because they're essential components of our diets. And that's why my wife, Cindy, makes sure that I have a lot of carrots, so I get my beta carotene, and a lot of tomatoes, so I get my lycopene, and whatever that is, so I get my lutein. And when I eat these things, it stimulates my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a strong immune system. Carotenoids are also antioxidants. They run around our body and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. Improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this Bathonetary warbler is a male who's bright yellow because he's had access to a lot of luteins. And he takes his luteins and he makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Where are they getting their carotenoids from? Well, from what they eat, but carotenoid content in bird prey items is not equal. These first two bars are types of caterpillars, far more carotenoids in caterpillars than anything else. Third bar is orthopteroids, things like crickets and katydids and grasshoppers. Here are the adult caterpillars down here. The moths and the butterflies themselves, they have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm down here. The early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that and lots of other evidence is suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diet. It looks like they're essential parts of bird diet. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough, or is one or two a day enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees. There's a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? If you don't reproduce, you don't have a population very long. So reproduction is a pretty important time. How many caterpillars? Well, one or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just to get the chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count that. But I guarantee you, you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do because in so many places, that's all that's left, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yards. Chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest, and that's true for most birds. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not make all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline, and it directly causes bird decline. There's simply not enough to eat. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the group that said we have lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. We looked at their data set and split up the terrestrial birds into 2 groups. The species that require insects at some part of their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the species that don't. So a few birds like the doves and the finches can reproduce on seeds. They don't need insects. They actually gained some numbers in the last 50 years. But the bird species that require insects on average lost 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as insects go, so go our birds. So in the language of COVID, in an abundance of caution, we better start making landscapes that includes a lot of caterpillars, a lot of insects in general, because so many other things depend on those insects. And that is a new way to think about landscaping, because we spent the last 100 years developing landscapes, choosing plants that supported no insects or very few, because we thought plants were just decorations. We didn't care about their ecological roles in our landscapes. And if nothing ate them, that was just fine. And if something did eat them, we would kill it. So how do we change that mentality? How do we add caterpillars to our landscapes? Well, we add them by making the plants that support those caterpillars, which seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we're going to choose for our landscapes. And we have to be fussy because the caterpillars that are eating those plants are fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates it perfectly. If you don't have milkweeds, you don't have monarchs. That's the only choice. And it turns out, that's called host plant specialization. It turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a very effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well defended. And if you don't believe me, this summer, go out and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. That's my little joke. This isn't a joke, though. Insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect species cannot adapt to all of them. That's just too big a lift. So they pick one or two, and they get really good at getting around those defenses. They develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history with those particular plants for all those adaptations to fall into place. It doesn't happen overnight. And once they do fall into place, the insect's locked into eating those plant lineages. They didn't spend any evolutionary time developing adaptations for other plant lineages. And that's why when we bring plants in from other continents, most of our insects cannot eat them because they've never seen those defenses before. They've spent no time adapting to them. All I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we want to rebuild the food webs that support the natural areas where we humans are, we've got to pick the plants that are going to do that, because all plants don't. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when we do pick the right plants. And I'm going to start with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in. We moved in on a parcel of it's 10 acres of a farm that was broken up. It's a very old farm. It's been farmed almost 300 years. Excuse me. And the last thing they did was to mow it for hay because the soil was exhausted. But when you're mowing hay in this part of the world, you're really mowing all the invasive species that are here. So autumn olive and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and multiflora rose and bush honeysuckle and on and on and on. So when they stopped mowing and we moved in, this is what came back. The entire property was just covered with particularly plants from Asia. That's Cindy. She's getting ready to clear the land, to get rid of all of that. Took a while. It's a lot of work. There's no doubt about it, but she has done it. And anybody who's got a serious plant invasion problem, don't give up. You really can. Just pick at it. You will win in the end. What was I doing? Well, Cindy was clearing the land. I was putting the plants back. Well, I was telling her she was doing a great job, but I also was putting the plants back. And the object, of course, was to restore the biodiversity on this exhausted piece of farmland. And to do that, I had to put the plants back that supported the caterpillars, because remember, caterpillars are the basis of that food web. So here's an example. I wanted the Canadian owlet on our property. Wanted to see if I could attract it. I'd never even seen a Canadian outlet. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. But I did know that if you're going to have Canadian outlets, you've got to have meadow rue. That's the only plant that they eat. And we didn't have any meadow rue. I think it was here hundreds of years ago, but long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, planted them, grew very nicely. But this was early on. And I, you know, deep down, I had very little faith that Canadian outlets would ever be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for about a month and a half. Maybe it was 2 months. Finally went out, walked by, and the meadow rue was almost defoliated with Canadian outlets. They had found it right away. So there's a big success. Now we've got a good population of meadow rue and a good population of Canadian outlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. This is how we build the biodiversity on an exhausted piece of land. This is another example. This is the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. It has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's actually a specialist on this plant, Bidens aristosa. I did know where there were some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. It took about a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens aristosa, but they did, and now I've got a good population of both of these. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the hackberry emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it's a butterfly that ought to be here. But like its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. We had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find their hackberry, but they finally did. I walked by one of my hackberry trees last June, and there were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. Now we've added 6 species, and that's how it goes. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that eat goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is the goldenrod flower moth, and it has not come to our property, and I don't know why. That's what the caterpillars look like. But this is part of the fun. So this is anticipation. Every year I wait and see if the goldenrod flower moth has come. So it's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. One of these years I'm going to go out and find this caterpillar, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. I've heard people don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It is a really powerful plant ecologically. It does climb our trees, but it does not girdle them. It doesn't strangle them. It's not heavy. It doesn't pull them down like some of those alien vines do. Has good fall color. It's actually a great pollinator plant. Its flowers are not pretty. They're little yellowish things. You can hardly see them, but the bees love them. It makes wonderful fruits for the birds, very, very high in fat in the fall, which is what they need. And it's the major host plant for many of our large sphinx moths, which are the major source of nestling diet for cardinals, believe it or not. So things like the Pandora sphinx, that's what its beautiful adult looks like. The lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I could get the double-tooth prominent just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I wanted to take its picture. Well, it's a specialist on elm. So I planted American elm, got some seeds from the University of Delaware that has a few trees that never died. So I make thousands of seeds. They're in the gutters. So I picked them up, planted them, grew very nicely, and I got the caterpillar right away. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's pretty. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted some. The moth came and it spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted a lot of oaks, and we planted lots of other things. Those are just examples, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. It's enormous. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. And you know, I hear that from people. I don't want to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, if you can only enjoy it when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you enjoy what the oak is doing on your property, what it's contributing to the wildlife on your property, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns. And right away, they started to bring in particularly the moths that support the food webs at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, the juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar, a crocus geometer, standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. So you don't have to wait 400 years for your oak to start to contribute to your property, and you can appreciate this very valuable contribution. This is what our property looks like now, or will look like in about 2 weeks. I'll show you this just to I'm sitting in this window right up there now. To show you, we're very traditional. We got a little lawn here, but we put a lot of plants back, and that's the important point. And every time I put a new plant lineage on our properties, it's the potential of bringing in new species of moths. And 4 years ago, I decided to try to take a picture of every species of moth that we have on our property. I am now up to 1,042 species that I photographed. Still working on it. I added 4 species last week, so I'm not done. And that's just the moths. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. Now we've got 10 acres. So on Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 240,000th of the land area of Pennsylvania, we've got 40% of all the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania. And because each one of these has the potential of being a type of bird food, we have recorded 59 species of terrestrial birds that have bred on our 10 acres, which is 38% of all the terrestrial bird species that breed in Pennsylvania. Breed, not fly by. This is another headline we saw last fall. The World Wildlife Fund says that 2/3 of the Earth's wildlife have vanished since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it was easy. We just put the plants back that support these things. So I'm mentioning this so that you don't despair. We can turn these very frightening headlines around. Not if we do nothing, but if we start to, as Rich said at the beginning, we start to be good stewards of the land and landscape for wildlife, it will return. But I know what you're thinking. Well, I've got 10 acres and a lot of people in suburbia do not have that much land. Will it work on a smaller piece of property? That's a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they're in the middle of a typical development. The first thing they did was get rid of their primary invasive plant, which is Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. And then they planted a lot of species of natives, and they put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that were using their yard. They are up to 149 bird species. 35 warbler species have used their yard. Compared to our house, we've only had 8 warbler species at our house. So are they doing okay on 0.6 acres? Yes, they are. What about city yards, though? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, because right on the other side of that wall is O'Hare Airport, one of the runways for O'Hare. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. And Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's an island. There's no connectivity with any other type of preserved land. Well, she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, plus a water feature. And then she sat back and started to count the birds that have used her yard. And that's an old figure. It's up to 118 species of birds that she has recorded, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house. There it is. But what about city centers? 82% of us are said to live in cities. Are they all going to be left out? Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, but that reminds me, we've got a marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed anymore. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. All right, I was staring at Monarch's Delight in 2014, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bees, megachilid bees. I know they're leafcutter bees because they collect their pollen on their tummies, not on their legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very strict requirements, or they can't be there. They need pollen and they need nectar, but they also need soft leaves, and leaves of red buds are perfect because they can cut the edge out of those leaves and leave these little semicircles. You've probably noticed them. Excuse me. They roll up what they cut out into a tube and stuff it full of pollen, lay an egg on it, and that's how they reproduce. They stuff that whole package into a crack or a crevice. Well, there was a red bud growing right next to Monarch's Delight, and I'm sure that's why the megachilid bees were there. And I'm pretty sure that's why there were bumblebees as well. Bumblebees, of course, overwinter as queens. There are no workers when they emerge in the spring. Any bumblebee you see flying around now is a queen. It's trying to start a colony. So please don't kill any now. Because they've got a tough job. They've got to start the entire colony all by themselves. So they need an abundant amount of forage, of pollen and nectar, so they can do that. And redbud supplies that. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs. Now this was 2014, remember. In 2013, I had gone the entire year without seeing any monarchs. It was very depressing. And this was June, which is very early for monarchs to get up as far north as we are on the East Coast. They go up the Mississippi Valley much faster. So I was very encouraged. Maybe the monarchs weren't going to disappear after all. Why were they there? Well, we had Monarch's Delight, but there was another species of milkweed as well. I think it's purple milkweed. So they had nectar, but they had their host plant. That's all they need, nectar and their host plant, and they can reproduce. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, the middle of New York City. The High Line is it was an abandoned elevated railroad. And somebody went up there and noticed there were a whole bunch of native plants growing. Nobody had planted them. They got there by themselves. So they decided, let's put some money into it, renovate it, and make it a destination for people who live in Manhattan. And they've been extremely successful. Millions of people go to the High Line every year. It's 30 feet above the taxis, right in the middle of everything. And this is the amount of nature we're talking about. It's a 3-foot strip. There's the Monarch's Delight. This is Rick Dark. He was always after me to go see the beautiful plantings on the High Line. I'm not much of a city boy, so I always drag my feet. And, you know, seeing a beautiful plant with nothing using it is actually depressing to me. So I was never enthusiastic about this trip, but finally he dragged me there. And right away I saw the things that I just told you about. Somebody's just finished a study of the bees of the High Line. They're up to 30 species using this little strip of nature. So I was completely wrong. Things are finding these native plants in the middle of Manhattan, which convinces me if thoughtful native plantings can bring life back to Manhattan, we can do this anywhere. There are 4 things we need to think about, though, if we're going to succeed. And the first one is we've got to reduce the area we have in lawn in this country, because we've got over 40 million acres of lawn, which is bigger than the size of New England, dedicated to a status symbol, which is ecologically dead. So I'm not suggesting we get rid of it because status symbols are important to us, but let's cut the area in half. Let's put some important plants in the other half. We're still going to manicure the part of the lawn that we keep. So we'll still be good citizens. We won't be thrown out of our neighborhoods, but that will give us, if we replant half the area that's in lawn right now, that'll give us 20 million acres to put towards conservation. And if we do that at home, we can create a new national park at home, which I am calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonland, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? We get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with the natural world at our own time and our own pace. Maybe you had one as a child, but you've lost it. You can redevelop it or develop it for the first time. And you can do it avoiding crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, there are millions of other people there. And you have to pay an admission fee. Your homegrown national park is free, no travel hassles, and it's never closed. No matter what pandemic comes down the road, all you have to do is go outside. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential if you're going to really develop a relationship with that natural world. And it's certainly essential for our poor kids who, according to Richard Louv, are suffering from nature deficit disorder. They just have no exposure to it. So we're trying, we get 30 kids and put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour to a natural place. And they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. They get back on the bus and they go home, and that's their experience, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But what they really had an experience with is 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world in their yard, all they have to do is go outside alone, no parental supervision. Let them discover what works and what doesn't work on their own. Develop that personal relationship. Maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. And I'm learning that from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest piece of nature. It's a piece of grass with a hedge, about 10 square feet. But she has learned that Anoa lizards live there. And she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you disguise yourself with sticks and leaves so the lizards don't see you coming. And you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you've got that personal relationship. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground, catching lizards like this the rest of her life. I don't think. So far, she's proven me wrong. But I guarantee she will remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet, in part because of that experience. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get this book, Nature Play at Home by Nancy Stranisti. Dozens of great examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, it's a real thing. Go to our new website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. I'm looking at where we are now. Where are we? Way up here? Something like that. You put in your location, you follow the direction, put in your location and the amount of area you're going to convert from lawn into native planting, and your little piece of the county will pop up. So this is our attempt at social media. We're trying to get beyond the choir, beyond the people that would automatically do this, to people who may do it because it's a competition or they didn't know anything about it. So so far, we got over 6,000 people on the map. We are well on our way to converting 20 million acres, so you can join too. All right. Oh, by the way, it's free, it doesn't cost anything, and no, we're not using your data for anything. We're going to shrink the lawn, but the next thing we have to do is we got to plant the part of lawn, the area we take out of lawn. Which plants are we going to use? Some of those plants have to be what I call keystone plants. Remember the Roman arch? There's the arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take it out, the arch falls down. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses. We found out that just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our local food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food, which means 85, 86% of the native plants, they're contributing, but not all that much. So the question is no longer simply are natives better than non-natives? On average, they are, but there are a bunch of native plants that just don't do that much. So let's focus on the ones that do, those keystone plants. You know, you're building an ecological house in your yard. The keystone plants are the 2x4s of that house. You're not going to build your house out of wallpaper. So the 2x4s are essential. They're not the only thing that's going to go in the house, but they better be there or the house is going to fall down. So what we really want to focus on are the really productive plants that are available to us. They're better than benign plants, and they're certainly better than those ecologically destructive invasive ornamentals that we brought in from Asia: buckthorn, barberry, Bradford pear, burning bush. I mean, we can go on for a long time talking about those. They escape our yards, biologically pollute the land around us, and ecologically castrate them because those plants don't support the food web, and they replace the plants that do. I get an email once in a while from people saying, don't you know that ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not our metric anymore. I don't care whether they're native. I want to know whether they're productive. And I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. So they're there, but they're not contributing to the local landscape. What is? Well, in 84% of the counties of North America, and you people are at the northern limit, but in 84% of the counties, oaks are the #1 keystone plant. In the mid-Atlantic states where I live, they support 557 species of caterpillars, 557 species of bird food. I got to change this. It's over 950 species of caterpillars nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. Here's the role of keystone oaks are playing in my yard. Now remember, I've taken pictures of 1,042 moss species so far. Out of that 1,042 species, 916 have known host plants. So there's a bunch I don't know what they're eating. Out of the 916 plants, 273 species use oaks. And we have 69 genera of native woody plants in our property, and only one of them is Quercus, the oaks. We have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. But they support at least 30% of our moth species diversity, which in turn supports the bulk of our bird species diversity. So imagine what would happen to the biodiversity on our property if I took oaks out of the system. That's the role of keystone plants. How do you find out what the keystone plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder, the National Wildlife Federation website. You put in your zip code and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants ranked in terms of their ability to support caterpillars will pop up for your county. These are what many lists look like. I stopped because I ran out of room, but oaks are typically at the top, followed by either prunus or willows. Willows will be very high where you live because when oaks drop out, willows take over. Blueberries. Notice I'm saying native cherries, native willows, native oaks. I'm saying that because if you go to the nursery and you say, I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell you an ornamental cherry from Asia. I want to buy a willow. They'll sell you a weeping willow from Turkey. If you say I want to buy an oak, they probably sell you a Quercus acutissima, a sawtooth oak from China. You've got to specify that you want a native member of these native genera, because if you get a non-native member, it's going to reduce caterpillar use by 65%. We have measured that. These are the top herbaceous plants, not only in terms of supporting caterpillars. Goldenrods, for example, support 110 species of caterpillars, but goldenrods and various aster genera and sunflowers, just those 3 groups alone support well over 40 species of specialist bees. If you don't have them in your yard, you've lost 40 species of bees that can only be there if you have those plants. That's the role of keystone plants. All right, we're gonna reduce the area of lawn. We're gonna put in keystone plants, attract a lot of insects to our yard, particularly moths, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's research from Europe in particular that's very convincing that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines. These are all the ways that lights kill insects through exhaustion, collision with the light bulb, incineration, dehydration. The bat comes and eats them. Nocturnal insects, many of them are blinded by bright lights, and it keeps them from doing what they're supposed to be doing. Believe it or not, to me, this is good news. We have to turn around insect declines. We cannot tolerate it. If we do tolerate it, we're going to disappear ourselves. So we've got to fix that. And if this is one of the major causes of insect declines, it's the easiest one to turn around. Just turn off your light. Flick of a switch. What could be easier? But I know what you're going to say. Well, I can't turn that light over my garage off or the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on it. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you will notice is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white light, the white bulb out of that security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects than are those white wavelengths. If we switched out our white lights for yellow LED lights overnight, we would save billions of insects and probably billions of dollars too, because they're much more energy efficient. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn, put in keystone plants, turn out our lights, and then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all our insects. There's no end to the ways we like to kill our insects. This is a booming business all around the country. I hope it's not booming where you are, but maybe it is. And Mosquito Joe will say, this is okay because this is a natural product, and it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids from chrysanthemums. But cyanide is a natural product too, so that's not a good argument. He'll also say it only kills mosquitoes. Not so. Kills all the insects it comes in contact with. He's running around the country undoing everything I've been talking about for the last 15 years. The big thing is, though, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. That's way too hard. You have to kill 90% of the adult mosquitoes to control them in the adult stage. Mosquito Joe kills about 10%, and that's why he has to keep coming back. And that's why he's so expensive. You're paying a lot of money for something that doesn't work. If you want to kill mosquitoes, you kill them in the larval stage. And this is a good way a homeowner can do it in a very targeted way. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put straw or hay in that bucket and let it ferment for a couple of days. What you're doing is building up the colonies of diatoms and algae, and that's what mosquito larvae eat. And mother mosquitoes know that. So when they're full of eggs, they oviposit. They lay their eggs in that bucket. It's irresistible to them. And then you put in a mosquito dunk. You get this at the hardware store. It's not expensive. That's Bacillus thuringiensis. It is a natural bacterium that kills aquatic diptera. The only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquitoes, so you're not hurting any other insects. If a dragonfly gets here, doesn't hurt them a bit. If your dog drinks it or a bird drinks it, no problem. Now, don't go throwing this around marshes and natural lakes, because there are a lot of chironomids, midges, and things that are important parts of the food web. But in your bucket, it's only going to kill mosquitoes. The fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. So this is what the caterpillar does. It eats the leaves and then it spins a cocoon, hangs from the branch there. Then it emerges as an adult and does it all over again. I wish everything did that, but most of the species don't. 94% of them, 480 of those species, finish growing on the tree, then they drop from the tree and they wiggle away beneath the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree, and the ground is mowed and compacted to the point where it's way too hard for the caterpillar to get under there. And you know that we do this everywhere. So I am convinced, and this becomes an ecological trap. Any moth that lays an egg up here, the caterpillar develops and drops down and dies. I'm convinced that this type of landscape, which we do everywhere, is another major cause of insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. I'm not trying to discourage the use of cement or of trees in our cities, but I am trying to discourage the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. It ruins our watersheds. Cement, is a major releaser of carbon dioxide. It's laziness. We can do a lot better. This is what we typically do. We plant a tree in a lawn. Now, nobody's measured how well the caterpillars do in a situation like that, but I guarantee they do better in a situation like this, where you have a tree, then you have a layered landscape. You have maybe a dogwood here and an azalea here, ferns, you've got ground cover, the caterpillars drop down, the soil's all loose. It's a safe site. They're not going to be stepped on, they're not going to be mowed. They can spin a cocoon if they need to in the leaf litter, much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink your lawn. You put big beds around your trees, safe sites. It's also where you can use your ground covers, which create safe sites. Things like wild ginger or native pachysandra or foam flower or mayapple or ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. These are red maples. Anything developing on these trees will drop down. And even though it's the middle of a city, it's a safe site. They can complete their development. So we can do a lot better by thinking about how we landscape under our trees. Another student of mine has done some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest that there is room for compromise in how we choose our plants. And to me, that's good news. What she did was look at how well landscapes dominated by native plants can support chickadee populations compared to landscapes dominated by introduced plants. And the first thing she found is when they're dominated by introduced plants, those landscapes produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So the amount of bird food is reduced by 75%. They're 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So chickadees come to the landscape and then look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed, even though every place had a chickadee house up. If they did try, those nests contain 1.5 fewer eggs. Those nests were clutches were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. If you put all that together into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plants in your yard, because chickadees are foraging on woody plants, this is what you get. This is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you make that many babies, it's a sustainable population. It's not growing. Where's my little thing? It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults that die each year, you've got a growing population. And if you make fewer, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines overlap generously, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass in your yard non-native, as long as they're not invasive. So you can have your ginkgo, you can have your boxwood, things that aren't going to move around without destroying your food web, as long as 70% of the woody plant biomass in your yard is native. So this is the area of compromise that I'm excited about. If my message was you can't have any non-native plants, very few people would be listening. But we love our native plants. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. If we include those native plants, a lot of them, we can tolerate a lot of non-native plants. Can native plants be used in formal designs? Of course. This is a design taken from a drone. It's big. This is by Lynn O'Shaughnessy. It was her dream. She completed this. Every plant in that design is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe and in Lynn's garden every day. And I guess it's okay because in Europe, they're non-native plants. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. The message is that this is intentional. It's not a lazy homeowner who didn't weed out these things. It's diverse. It's supporting a number of species of native bees. It's not very big. It could be bigger, but let's quickly review why we need pollinators. The standard line is we need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. But then people think, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. They pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere, including our yards. This is a Drew Latham design. It's much bigger. Imagine the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and a lot of them are doing it, and Minnesota's leading the way. One of the earliest programs, a cost-sharing program to encourage homeowners to replace part or all of their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants, help you pay for it. Great program. Pennsylvania has followed suit. They've got a great one. You get up to $5,000 per acre if you are converting your lawn. Now, the motivation here wasn't to save biodiversity. It was to help watersheds. But I don't care what the motivation is. It works to save biodiversity. Maryland and Virginia are following suit. So that's great. There's an island off of Florida where they're paying people to allow burrowing owls to nest in the front yard, to burrow into the front yard. So this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written. Burrowing owls are listed species, by the way. They should have been written with carrots rather than sticks. If you've got an endangered species on your property, we'll pay you to take care of it, as opposed to fining you if you use the property. Missouri, Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on Callery pears. You take out a Callery pear, one of the most invasive plants we have, by the way, and they'll give you a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act. San Antonio Water System giving people $100 coupons to take out water thirsty non-natives and put in water efficient native plants. And then of course we have those great lawn conversion programs in the far west where it's too dry to have lawn. California, for example, $2 per square foot rebate if you get rid of your lawn and put in appropriate xeric plants. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first one is that we have not really embraced the idea that nature is essential. And we like it. Some of us think it's important, but not essential. And that means when push comes to shove, whenever resources are short, supplied, then nature loses. You realize that Congress has classified the National Park Service budget as non-essential. And you realize the entire budget for the National Park Service is equal to 1 B-1 bomber. It's low priority, low priority. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes what people think of conservation. We want to save nature for future generations. And you know, that was Teddy Roosevelt's argument. We got to create these national parks so people in the future can enjoy them. But to me, that suggests nature is there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. Entertainment is not essential. Nature is essential. We got to save it so that we have future generations. It's not about entertainment. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about this by restricting conservation just to places where there aren't a lot of people. That's doomed it to failure because those places are not big enough and they're too isolated from each other to sustain the species that we need. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug, and that is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests they're places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our roadsides, including our corporate landscapes, even much of our agriculture. Which means we've got to glue our rug back together again by putting not just plants back, but we got to really focus on those keystone plants. We're not building biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth. We're going to create viable habitat right where it doesn't exist now, which means we're going to start to live with nature for the very first time. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet, but I don't see why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. And we've been great at teaching this one. We've been poor at teaching our kids and our peers what their obligations to earth stewardship is. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live, which empowers you. You know, right now, so many of us feel powerless. We can't deal with the Earth's problems as a single person because they're so huge. But in this case, the cliche is correct. One person can make a difference, and you can watch that difference. You can measure it right on your yard. Shrink your lawn, put in a pollinator garden, get rid of your invasive plants and put in those keystone plants, and watch your ecosystem explode right on your property. It makes you as an individual an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't worry about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about your piece of the planet, the piece you can influence. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you're going to focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded, all understaffed. They will love you. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. Now, I'm pretty sure I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Wow, that was wonderful, Doug. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Oops, just lost my screen. Do you have time for a few questions? I can.
Sure, I do. Sure.
We'll take a few questions. I'm going to get them out of the chat that I've seen come up, and a lot of people are saying this is fantastic, awesome. They love it. Lots of kudos, of course. I knew they would love it.
It's always good to hear.
So one question someone had, a couple people mentioned, what's the best way to get ground cover growing under their trees? What are some things that you would do to get that going, plants and wise?
You know, if you're trying to create habitat under your trees for those caterpillars, I would start with leaf litter. Make a leaf litter bed, which will it will loosen up the soil that's there, and then you can plant right through that bed. It'll hold the moisture in. A lot of times under shady trees, it's very dry, but the leaf litter holds the moisture. Then you can put any of the appropriate ground covers in, and they'll do a whole lot better. You know, my son bought a house a couple of years ago, and the first fall he was there, he called me up and he said, Dad, I've got too many leaves. What should I do with the leaves? I said, put them in your flower beds. He said, I don't have enough flower beds. I said, exactly. That's what you do with your leaves, is you build those. That's how you're getting rid of your lawn. You're building those flower beds around your trees. And it also makes it, you know, you don't have to do it all at once. You can create that leaf flower bed and then add to it when you get time. But that's how I would do it.
Thanks. I did want to mention something. Someone told me Representative Kelly Morrison was on this. I don't know if she still is. She authored the lawns to legume legislation that you mentioned, and she was watching tonight.
Oh, the minister. Well, good for her. Oh,
yeah,
give her a hug.
It's wonderful.
Give her a hug.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's see. Someone said, if we only target caterpillars, are we missing anything important? Are there other insects or creatures we should be strive to support in our yards?
Well, the big one I didn't talk about in this talk is those pollinators. Sure, all the insects are important, but you know, the caterpillars are again indicator species. If you plant and have a lot of caterpillars, you've got a lot of other things too. But we can't ignore those pollinators, and it's often not the same plants that are going to support the most pollinators. So for example, oaks that support the most caterpillars are wind pollinated. So actually we're developing an independent list on the National Wildlife Federation website for specialist pollinators. You want to plant for the specialist because the generalist can use those plants as well. If you plant for the generalists, the ones that can use lots of plants like honeybees, then you lose the specialists. So we want to plant for the specialists. And what we're making for each ecoregion is a list of the plants that support the specialist bees. When I say we, I'm really talking about Jared Fowler, who's done this work. And you can go to his website right now where he's got them all listed. Jared Fowler, you'd have to look it up. I don't know what it is, but the Google knows everything. So that's another group that we can't ignore.
Let's see, someone says, what do you tell landowners about the lack of deer control? We can't fence everything and this issue causes apathy. We have our deer.
Right, it also causes Lyme disease and it's destroying our forests. It's a big ecological problem. Nothing can exist forever without top-down controls. That includes humans, by the way. And those things are starting to happen. What do you think? What do you think the COVID is? It's we've got so many people crowded together that something is going to start to control our populations. But I know we don't want to go there. So let's talk about deer. We take away the predators and wonder why we have too many deer. They're not going to grow forever. They will wipe out their food supply eventually. We're going to get the various deer diseases. But in the meantime, they cause huge problems because they're way over their carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the number of deer that the area can support without ecological destruction. And where I live, it's about 14 deer per square mile. There are times we've been 14 times over the carrying capacity. So, that's not good. We know how to control deer. This is not a mystery. We just decide we don't want to do it. So.
Here's an insect question for you. Said someone, last year I had hundreds of black and red milkweed beetles on my milkweed. Should I let them take over?
They don't take over. That's the large milkweed bug, Onchopeltis fasciatus. It's one of the things that normally eat milkweed. And what they're eating is the outer layer of seeds on your milkweed pods. They are not sucking juice from the leaves or from the stems. So they build up at the end of the summer, and then you'll notice they all of a sudden disappear. You know why? They migrate down to the Gulf Coast, where milkweeds continue to make seeds all winter long, and then they migrate back up again and reproduce up here when there's a lot of milkweed seeds. So yes, it's part of the one of the species that uses milkweeds, and absolutely leave them alone.
How do you compete with highly invasive plants when trying to plant native plants?
You get rid of them.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard. I'm still bitter about the fact that I have to do that. 100 years ago, I could have just let it go, let nature take its course, and it would have all been natives. I could have manipulated it in any way I wanted, but you just can't do that now. If you let it go, it becomes, dominated by invasive plants. That's a tremendous amount of work that we have inflicted on ourselves. So one thing I would suggest is that we stop selling them in our nurseries. The other thing I would say is get rid of them on your property. Again, don't worry about other places because it's a big enough job on your property. And if everybody did that, we'd be 75 to 85% done in this country, which would reduce the seed rain on our public places, and it would be easier to get them under control. We're never going to get rid of them, but we have to get them under control. And that's another reason to control deer populations, because the deer don't eat those. The deer like the native plants just like the insects do, which tips the competitive balance against our native plants. Every time an oak tree pops up, the deer eats it. No wonder they're not gonna replace those natives. When there's deer exposure experiments, you find out our natives are much more competitive than we thought they were. So it's another good reason to control the deer.
I have a question. I just had to throw this in. I was reading your book and you mentioned the toilet roll that you bury for bees. Could you tell people about that?
Yeah. Discovered that accidentally. I wanted to see if we had termites around the house. And if you take a full termite roll and bury it with the hole up, you made 2/3 of the way down in the soil, and do it under the eaves where it's not going to get wet. And if there's any termites there, they'll come up into it and you can pull them out and you say, uh-oh, I've got termites. And then so I actually put them around the house. We were getting ready to sell the house and I needed to determine whether we had termites. But I got bumblebees instead. They went in the home, they chew up all the paper and make, a nice little nest, and they like to nest in holes. So apparently it doesn't happen very commonly, but it happened at my house, and other people have tried it, and occasionally it happens. Bumblebees have been reported in bluebird houses and very strange places where there's a hole and they can get out of the way.
Question from one of the fellow Ikes. Intensive agriculture has probably had more impact on native plant and animals than any other endeavor. Have you had any success reaching farmers with this powerful message?
Well, I haven't focused on farmers. I've focused on homeowners. And you know what? If you add up the amount of land, 41% of the US is in some form of agriculture, and 54% is in the suburban urban matrix. So intensive agriculture is bad news for sure, but there's actually more land and everything else that we've dominated with all those Asian ornamentals. So both need to be addressed. I haven't spent my time on what, it's called regenerative agriculture, and a lot of people are working on it. And I know in Iowa, they've made a lot of progress with pollinator strips, which intercept nutrients before they run off the farm and provide, habitat for pollinators. You know what, when you tell a farmer or grower to take part of his land out of protection and do something that's ecologically sound, I think that farmer should be compensated for that, because he's producing ecosystem services for everybody who doesn't own a farm, everybody who lives in a city. I think we should have a pay per use. It's just like pay per view. You pay to see a Netflix. We got to pay per use when we use the earth. Every year, $10 for your use of the earth. One trip to Starbucks, that would generate in this country $3.2 billion that we could compensate farmers with. We could get rid of the dead zone in the Gulf. We could do a lot of good things and nobody would even notice it. But we're not going to call it a tax, because then that won't work. But I mean, the earth is not free anymore. Nothing's free here. There is no free lunch. So let's compensate the grower to be a little bit more ecologically sound, and they'll respond. You pay somebody, they'll do it.
A couple more questions. Someone's wondering about the mycorrhizal soil fungi that associate with oaks. If we plant new oaks, how can we encourage those important associated fungi to flourish?
They will colonize eventually, but you can really speed it up by going to an existing oak of the same species and gathering up some leaf litter and maybe a little bit of soil and inoculating the soil around where you planted your oak. That's all it takes. And those mycorrhizal associations will take off.
Okay, I think I'll do one more question here. If you have a native plant garden, do you need to clean out the last season's dead plants or leave them? Will the thick debris hinder new growth?
You mean new growth of plants, or do you need to clean it out? Will it hurt the insects that are in that debris?
I think they must mean, it says new growth, but I'd say talk about the insects.
Yeah. Well, life is full of trade-offs. So when I say keep all the leaves on your property, you can't make a pile of 4 feet of leaves and expect something to grow up through that. It won't. But a natural layer of leaf litter, there's a lot of, even our most dainty spring ephemerals can push their way through that. And I'm trying to document that in my own property this spring. But in some of the very fancy, like that, I showed you a picture from Mount Cuba Center in Hockessin, Delaware, of a really nice spring ephemeral garden. A big layer of leaves on that is not going to help it for sure. So, if that's really your thing, then thin the leaves out in those areas. But for a lot of things, wood poppies and ferns and a lot of things, you don't have to do anything. They push right through the Mayaples, the Jack in the Pulpit. So you don't, certainly don't rake them down to the soil and burn everything the way we've been doing. You don't need to do that. And when you do that, everything that's in that leaf litter, you've just killed.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I know he's on East Coast time, so it's getting a little later there. We have to remember that. And this was wonderful, Doug. And I hope everybody goes and gets his books. They are just wonderful to read and really inspiring, like his talk. We will be posting this presentation. Give me a couple days and I'll have it up on Sugarloaf's front page, sugarloafnorthshore.org. It'll take you to a YouTube recording of it. So you can
Could you
share
send me
this.
that link too?
Sure, sure. And we'll get,
Great.
we got to get this message out to everyone so that we can get more restoration done on our land. So I really appreciate it. And everyone is just thrilled here. Someone just
Okay,
said
well,
they
thanks.
ordered all your books. So
Excellent. Thank you.
all right. And if
All
you get a
right.
second, please make a donation to any of the organizations that sponsored this program tonight, Sugarloaf, the Duluth Ikes, and Arrowhead Wild Ones. So thank you, everyone.
Okay.
And thank you,
Good
Doug.
night, everybody. You're welcome.
Right.
Good night.
Good night.
Molly?
Yes, yeah.
Hi. Thank you. It went really well. What do you think?
I'm going to stop the recording.